one at a burger shop. And I won 100-year supply of noodle products. Since then, for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, I'm eating noodles. At first, I liked it, but now, I don't even want to look at it. The only thing that gets me going is the lovely Sunny Funny and her sweet smile. I'll do anything for her. I know! I got it! No! I can't believe.
Parappa, I didn't know you were such a baby. Such a baby. Such a baby.
But little did I know, this was the beginning of a long adventure. Say alright! Say oh yeah! What you gonna do? I gotta believe!
May I help? You want to load or save? Loading. Load complete.
Parappa, relax. It's practice time. Cook those burgers!
Cook those burgers!
Turn the patty over!
Turn the patty over!
Cook those burgers!
Cook those burgers!
Okay.
That's right. I'm in the house. Here it comes. Extra, extra, read all about it. The best burgers in town from all around. People from around the world come and get it. The line goes around like a merry-go-round. Cut! Cut! Heat! Yes, there you go. And toast. I have nothing more to teach you. Let me rest in peace.
Cook the burgers, French the fries, toast the bun, the burgers, grill the burgers, grill, grill the bun, toast the bun, the burgers, toast those buns, French fries, said the execute tuna, the burgers, cut lettuce, grill those burgers, those burgers, those burgers, those hot toast buns, toast buns, French the fry, better execute sooner, better execute sooner. Grill, better execute sooner. French fries, those burgers, better execute sooner. Those burgers, better execute those burgers. Those burgers, sooner. Let it hot, let it sooner. Grill, toast the bun, sooner. French fries, those burgers. French, the burgers, those burgers, those burgers, those burgers. French, the French, those burgers, those burgers, those French, those burgers, those grill. French hot lettuce, those burgers, those French hot, those French hot, those French hot, those French heat, the French toast, those French hot, those French heat, those French heat, those French hot, those French hot, those French heat, those French toast, those French hot, those French heat, those French hot, the lettuce, grill, French, the French, those burgers, better execute sooner, better French fry, French the fry, hot, the lettuce, those burgers, better French the fry, grill, those burgers, better those burgers, the grill, toast buns, those burgers,
Yeah, you the man, terrific.
That was a party, and I feel fine.
Parappa, relax. It's practice time. Duck, punch. Twist, punch. Turn, punch.
Duck, punch. Twist, punch. Turn, punch.
Love, chop. Hug, chop. Kiss, chop.
Love, chop. Hug, chop. Kiss, chop.
Duck, punch. Twist, punch. Turn, punch.
Duck, punch. Twist, punch. Turn, punch.
Love, chop. Hug, chop. Kiss, chop.
Love, chop. Hug, chop. Kiss, chop.
Duck, punch. Twist, punch. Turn, punch.
Duck, punch. Twist, punch. Turn, punch.
Love, chop. Hug, chop. Kiss, chop.
Love, chop. Hug, chop. Kiss, chop.
Duck, punch. Twist, punch. Turn, punch.
Duck, punch. Twist, punch. Turn, punch.
Love, chop. Hug, chop. Kiss, chop.
Love, chop. Hug, chop. Kiss, chop.
Duck, punch. Twist, punch. Turn, punch.
Duck, punch. Twist, punch. Turn, punch.
Love, chop. Hug, chop. Kiss, chop.
Love, chop. Hug, chop. Kiss, chop.
Okay, that's it.
Yes, it is time to get romantic. Time to get romantic, yes, and remains very secure, never bending, always the fast to make a move. This time we get down nice and slow. Ha 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 ha. Kick, love.
Kick, love.
Love, punch.
Love, punch.
Love, duck, love.
Love.
Ich, ni, son. Now it's your turn. Show me freestyle.
I hold you tight, lovers. We are soft, chopping, love, punches. We kick, chop, kick, pun, kick, chop, kick, chop, kick, chop, kick, pun, kick,
Congratulations, hallelujah, Banzai 3. You are the best. See you again on Romantic Karate.
So, this is romantic.
Let's begin. Time's up.
Parappa, relax. It's practice time. Get me out of this, and now push the button.
Get me out of this and now push the button.
Come on, I'm big all of a sudden.
Come on, come on, all of it, come on.
Okay, that's it. Good luck.
Yeah, you wanna be big, you wanna grow big. Revolutions all the time, people changing the world with crime, with violence and anger, hunger, whatever. I find that ridiculous, if not meticulous. I do my best to guard my own premises. What's your name? What's your name, fool?
What's my name? What's my name, fool?
What's that sound? Who that be? Huh?
What's that sound? Who that be? Huh?
I can't take it no more. I need you to get out of here. You're on your own.
I think I'm big. What's going on? What's going on? What's going on? You're really big. SOS, SOS. Please handle you with care. You weren't dead. I think I'm big, kid. I think I must have been dreaming. You enjoy your time. You enjoy your time. John too. You enjoy your time. I think I'm big. I think I'm. What's going on? You enjoy your big, kid. What's going on? What's going on? You weren't dead. I must have been dreaming. You weren't dead. SOS, SOS. I must have been dreaming. You enjoy. Please handle you with care. What's going on? What's going on? You weren't dead. I must have been dreaming. You enjoy your SOS, SOS. You enjoy your SOS. I think I'm big. I think I'm big, kid. What's going on? I think I'm. What's going on? You weren't dead. I must have been big. SOS, SOS. Please handle you with care. What's going? You're really. I think I'm. You weren't. You You enjoy your time. You enjoy your time. It don't ever happen again. I think I'm big. I think I'm. You enjoy your SO. What's going on? What's going on? SOS. Please handle you with care. You weren't dead. I must have been SOS. What's going on? What's going on? SOS. You enjoy it. I think I'm big. I think I'm big, kid. I think I'm. What's going on? You enjoy your big time. You jump too. You weren't dead. I must have been dreaming. You enjoy your time. You jump too. You enjoy. What's going on? I think I'm. What's going on? You're really big. SOS. SOS. You weren't dead. I must have been dreaming. It don't ever happen again, big kid. I think I'm big again. Just time. You jump too. You enjoy again. Just time. You jump too. You weren't dead. I must have been dreaming again. Dreaming again. Dreaming. Dreaming. Dreaming again. Dreaming. Dreaming. Dreaming again. Dreaming again. Dreaming again. 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 You enjoy your time. You jump too. What's going on? What's going on? SOS. SOS. You weren't dead. I must have been big. I think I'm big, kid. I think I'm dreaming big. You enjoy your time. You jump too big. You're really. I think I'm big, kid. What's going on? What's going? What's going? What's going on? What's going? What's going on? SOS. SOS. Please handle you with care. You enjoy your time. You weren't dead. I must have been dreaming. I think I'm big. I think I'm dreaming. You enjoy your dreaming time. You jump too. You enjoy your dreaming. It don't ever happen again. You weren't dead. I must have been dreaming. You enjoy it. What's going on? What's going on? You're really. I think I'm big. Yeah. What's going on? What's going on? You're really. I think I'm big. Yeah. SOS. 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 You enjoy your time. You jump too. You enjoy. What's going on? You enjoy. What's going on? It don't ever happen again. You promise. You promise. It don't ever happen.
My, oh my, you've grown to be a fine young man.
You too, teacher. You've grown too.
Parappa, relax. It's practice time. Beep,
Beef.
beep,
Fatigue.
keep your body tight.
Keep your body tight.
Remember,
Remember,
never
never
go down without a fight.
go down without a fight.
Beep,
Beef.
beep,
Fatigue.
keep your body tight.
Keep your body tight.
Remember,
Remember.
okay, that's it.
Attention, attention! Come on, everybody, let's go! Up to it! 1, 2, let's go! Come on! Fancy cars, gold chains don't mean a thing. Word to your brain, things my game. Ride the terrain, smooth with no pain. I come from the streets, no such thing as pain. Jump, jump,
Jump, jump.
flip, flip,
Flip, flip.
do the flip,
Do the flip.
flip,
Flip, flip.
do the jump, flip.
Do the jump. Flip.
Hey, hey, you sure know how to train. I have nothing to teach you no more.
Do it, flick. Do it, do it, flick. Do it, do it, flick. Do it right now. You carry the flick camera for all your adventures. Get tired, please take the break. You carry it. Remember, never go down without a fight. Remember, get tired, please take a break. Get tired, camera for all your adventures. You do this every single day. You carry the camera. Do it, flick. Do it, flick right now. Get tired, please take the break for all your adventures. You carry your camera. You carry every single adventure. Get tired, please take a adventure. Right now, do it, flick, do it, flick. You carry a count, you carry a count. You do this every single day. You gotta do this. You carry a count for all. You gotta do this. You carry a count. You gotta do this. You carry a count every single day. Get tired, please take a break. Get tired, please take a break. Right now, do it, flick. Remember, go down without a fight. Remember, go down. Remember, never go down without a fight. You carry a count. You carry a count. You carry. Get tired, please take a break. Get tired, please take a do it, flick. Do it, flick. You carry a count. You carry for your adventure. You got to do this. You carry every single count day. Get tired. You do this every single day. You carry a count. You got to do this every single day. Right now. Remember, go down without a day. Do it, flick. Do it, day. Please take a break. You carry a count right now. Get tired. You got to do this every single day. You do this every right now. Do it. Please take break. You carry a count. You carry a count right now. Get tired. Please take a break. You get tired. Please take a count right now. For all your adventure, you carry a count. Do it, flick. For all your adventure. Never go down without it. Remember, never go down. Right now. Get tired. Do it down. Right. Do it down. Right. Do it, flick. Do it down. Right, flick. You carry it down. Right, count for all your down. Right, adventure. Do it, flick. Do it, flick. Do it down. Right, flick. Adventure. You carry it down. Right. Do it, flick. Do it, flick. Do it, flick. Carry. Right.
You're the best I've ever seen. Let's take a picture.
I'd be glad to. I feel fine.
Let's begin.
Hey! Parappa, relax. It's practice time. Cut your hair.
Cut the hair.
Flat back and up front.
Flat back and up front.
Give you a perm.
Give you a perm.
And now we're done.
And now we're done.
Cut your hair.
Cut the hair.
Flat back and up front.
Flat back and up front.
Give you a perm.
Give you a perm.
And now we're done.
And now we're done.
Okay, that's it. Good luck.
All right, check that out. Everyone's head's turning into noodles.
Wow, that's a cool afro. But that afro's growing bigger.
Introducing the new flavor! Cutting hair can be fabulous. So don't just stand there. Come inside, have a seat, and relax. I promise you, everything will be alright. Okay, baby, let's go. We're going to do it like this. Trim, trim,
Trim, trim,
trim, trim, trim.
trim, trim, trim.
Caramba! I hate it when there's a lot of hair on the floor. Here, I'll go clean up.
Cut the hair, flat back and up front. I'm not stop, my body's just moving. Rinse you good, I made you look tall. Dye your hair, blow up and down. Cut the hair, flat back and up front. I'm not stop, my body's just moving. Keep the line, moving. Keep the line, moving. With the shampoo, I give it to you all. Rinse you good with the shampoo. Cut the hair, flat back and up front. Cut the hair, flat back and up front. I'm not stop, dye your hair, blow up and my body's just moving. With the shampoo, I give it to you all. Cut the hair, flat back and up front. I'm not stop, my body's just moving. Rinse you good, I made you look tall. Keep the line, moving. Cut the hair, flat back and up front. With the shampoo, with the shampoo, with the shampoo. I give it to you all. Cut the hair, flat back and up front. I'm not stop, my body's just moving. Rinse you good, I made you look tall. Dye your hair, blow up and down. Dye your hair, blow up, cut, rinse you good, I made you look tall, just tall, just cut, keep the line, cut, just cut, rinse you good, I'm just cut line, 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 just cut, made you cut line, made you cut line, cut line, and down, dye your hair, blow up, and made you cut the line, made you cut in line, move it, I'm not stop, my body just moving, keep the line, move it, cut the hair, back and up front, I'm not stop, my body just cut the hair, back and up front, keep the line, move it, cut the hair, back and up front, I'm not stop, my body cut the hair, back and up front, just keep the line, move it, dye your hair, blow up and down, dye your hair, I'm not stop, my body cut the hair, keep the line, just keep the line, move it, flat back and up front, cut the hair, move it, rinse good, I made you look, move it, blow up and down, dye your hair, blow up and down, cut the hair, flat back and up front, I'm not stop, my body just move it, with the shampoo, I give it to you all, I'm not stop, with the shampoo, I give it to you all, cut the hair, flat back and up front, with the shampoo, rinse you good, I made you look tall, front.
Whoa! Did you fix everyone's hair? I'm going to hire you right now.
Well, I'm not old enough.
relax. It's practice time. With this shampoo, give it to you all.
With this shampoo, give it to you all.
Rinse, you look tall.
Rinse, you look tall.
With this shampoo, give it to you all.
With this shampoo, give it to you all.
Rinse, you look tall. Okay, that's it.
Hey everybody, watch out for those flying noodles. Cause if you don't do well here, all you get to eat are noodles. Here we go.
Extra, extra, read all about it. I'm back for more because my store's a bore. I travel shore to shore, door to door, looking around for some perfect store. Cut lettuce through.
Cut the lettuce, cut the lettuce, cut the roll.
Toast the buns through.
Toast the bun, toast the bun, toast the bun.
The newest game with cutting-edge technology. Straight to you. Check it out.
French the fry, cook the burger, the master is original. High heat, my style is unforgettable. With the shampoo, you give it to me, oh yeah. Rinse me good, up ramps, we go all the way. Do it, you made me look tall. Come on, now we ain't got it all day. With the shampoo, you give it to me, oh yeah. Rinse me good, you made me look tall. Up the ramps, we go all the way. Do it, with the shampoo, you give it to me, oh yeah. Rinse me good, come on, now we ain't got it all day. French the fry, cook the burger, up ramps, we go all the way. Do it, with the shampoo, you give it to me, oh yeah. Bow, yeah. Do it now, yeah. Do it now, bow, yeah. Do it, French fry, cook the burger. Come on now, we ain't got it all day. The master is original. High kick, my style is unforgettable. Rinse me good, you made me look tall. French the fry, cook the burger with the shampoo. French the fry, cook the burger with the shampoo. French the fry, yeah. Do it now, yeah. Do it, pull a level or whatever. Right now, better make it quick. Come on, get down. You give it to me, oh yeah. Rinse me good, you make me look tall. With the shampoo, you give it to me now. Yeah, now, cook the burgers. French the fry, cook the burger. Up the ramps, we go all the way. Do it, come on now, we ain't got it all day. Oh yeah, rinse me good, you make me look tall. With the shampoo, the master is bomb. Yeah, do it now, yeah. Do it, pull level or whatever. Right, the master is original. High kick, my style is unforgettable. With the shampoo, you give it to me. Oh yeah, rinse me good, you make me look tall. Up the ramps, we go all the way. Do it, yeah. Do it now, yeah. Do it now, yeah. Do it now. Come on now, we ain't got it all day. French the fry, cook the day. With the shampoo, you give it to me. Oh yeah, rinse me good, you made me look day. The master is day. Pull level or whatever. Right now, better make it quick. Come on, get day. With the shampoo, you give it to me day. Oh yeah, rinse me good, you make me look day. Yeah, do it, yeah. With the shampoo, you give it to me. Oh yeah, do it now. Yeah, do it now. Yeah, do it good, you made me look tall. With the shampoo, you give it to me. Oh yeah, rinse me good. The master is original. Pull the level or whatever. You make me look tall. French fries, cook the burger right now. Yeah, do it now. Better make it quick. With the shampoo, you give it to me. Oh yeah, come on, get down. Up ramps, we go all the way. Do it. Pull the level or whatever right now. Better make it quick. Yeah, do it now. With shampoo, you give it to me. Oh yeah, French the fry, cook the burger. French the fry, come on, get down. Up ramps, we go all the way. Do it. With the shampoo, the master, yeah, do it now. With the shampoo, you give it to me. Oh yeah, the master is original. High kick, my style is unforgettable. The master is bomb. Yeah, do it now. With shampoo, you give it to me. Oh yeah, up the ramps, we go all the way. Do it original. Pull the level or whatever. Right now, better make it quick. Come on, get original. Rinse me good, you make me look original. Come on now, we ain't got it all day. French the fry, cook the burgers. With the shampoo, French the fry, cook the burgers. With the shampoo, you give it to me. Oh yeah, with the shampoo, you give it to me. Oh.
Oh my, rapper.
Dad, you okay?
Let's begin.
Parappa. Relax. It's practice time. Don't ask me why. Don't ask me why. Noodles are the best, can't deny.
Don't ask me why. Don't ask me why. Noodles are the ass.
Don't ask me why. Don't ask me why. Noodles are the best, can't deny.
Don't me. Don't me. Don't me. Don't me. Don't me.
Don't ask me why. Don't ask me why. Noodles are the best, can't deny. Don't ask me why. Don't ask me why. Noodles are the best, can't deny. Okay.
Yeah, we're gonna bring it down like this, y'all. I'm gonna let my man Parappa know that noodles rule the world. Yeah, that little slippery thing tastes so good all the time. Yeah, that's right. It goes a little something like this. Stay with me now, here we go.
Like this.
In parentheses, let me stress the fact clearly. No matter what the deal, I crave for this dearly. The so-called noodles that you find in spaghetti are sweeter than idols, do damage like machetes. Without a doubt, I got the flow coming at July. Bring the place alive every single day I jive. With the thought comes my direct actions. Ask my followers, they'll say it's an addiction. Slurp it, suck it, I know you like it.
Slurp it, suck it, I know you like it.
Smell it, taste it, pasta in a market.
Smell it, taste it, fruit in a basket.
Chinese, Italian,
Mexican, Egyptian,
Thai or Jamaican.
Korean.
Anything goes.
Anything goes.
All right, it's time for me to go brush my teeth. You better keep it up.
Great taste is sweet, flow to my chest. C-double-O-K-I-E-S. The body you love noodles so dearly. Noodles are the best tea. It makes no sense. You must have sounded real ear. The body you love noodles so dearly. The body you love. Great taste is sweet, flow to my. Great taste is sweet. The body you love, flow to my chest. But again, many things can be.
What's going on? What happened?
What?
Great taste is sweet, C-double-O-K-I-E-S. Noodles are the best, no doubt. Can't. Great taste is sweet, flow to my chest. Great taste is sweet, any type of sweets you like. Yes, I got it. Noodles are the best, no doubt. Can't deny the body you love noodles so dearly. But again, many things can be tasty. Great taste is sweets, any type of sweets, any type of sweets, any type of sweets. But then again, any type of sweets. But then again, you like. Yes, I got it. Noodles are the best. The body you love noodles so dearly. It makes no sense. You must have sounded real ear. Any type of sweets, but again, any type of sweets. Many things can be tasty. You like? Yes, I got it. Great taste is sweet. Great taste is sweet. Great taste is great. Noodles are the best. Great taste is sweet. Flow to my chest. C-double-O-K-I-E-S. Noodles are the best. Noodles are the best, no doubt. Noodles are the best. Noodles are the best. Noodles are the best. No can't. C-double-O-K-I-E-S. 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 Great taste is sweet. Flow to my chest. Great taste is sweet. Any type of great taste is sweet. Flow to my chest. Great taste is sweet. Flow. C-double-O-K-I-I. Blow. Any type of sweets.
Alright, now you can eat all the other great foods in life. Oh yeah, thanks man. I'm real hungry now. Let's see, I could have ice cream, pasta, sushi, burritos, bagels, steak, lobster, burger. Yeah, I could even have burgers. I'm sure I could probably make it my own.
once again, the final party. Is everybody ready to do this? Well, come on, let me hear you say ho, say ho, ho, say ho, ho, ho. Now scream! It's party time. Come on, everybody. You can do is shake your body.
It's party time, come on, party. You can do it, everybody.
Come on out on the floor and rock it till you want some more.
Come on out on the floor and rock it till you want some more.
Wave your hands from left to right. Feel the rhythm, enjoy the ride.
Wave your hands from left to right. Feel the rhythm, enjoy the ride.
Hey, now look at Parappa and how he's become a man. Enjoy the show.
If you got a problem, what you gonna do? Like Parappa, cut corner, he never gives up. Say, yeah. What you gonna do? I gotta believe. Say, yeah. What you gonna do? I gotta say, yeah. If you got a problem, what you gonna do? Yeah. People in the front, people in the back, side to side. People in front, people in the front, people in the front, people in the front, people in the front. If you got a problem, what you gonna do? Like Parappa, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. Say, yeah. What you gonna do? I got a Parappa. Wave your hand from left to Parappa. Cause they cut corner, he never gives right. People in that side to side. Let's all get Parappa. Believe. Feel the rhythm. Enjoy Parappa. 1, 2, 3, 4, and Parappa. People in the front, people in the back. Wave your hand from left to right. Wave your hand from left to right. Feel the rhythm. Enjoy the ride. Say, oh yeah. What you gonna do? Say, oh yeah. If you got a problem, what you gonna do? Like Parappa, what you gonna do? Parappa, people in the front, people in the back, side to side. Let's all get Parappa. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, 6, 7, 9, and 10. Cause that corner, he never gives up. That's why he's always the number 1. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and Parappa, 9, and 10. 1, 2, 3, Parappa, 3 down. People in the front, people in the back, side to side. Let's all get Parappa. Wave hands from left to right. Feel Parappa, feel Parappa, feel Parappa, feel Parappa. Cause they got corner, he never gives Parappa. I gotta believe. Say, yeah. What gonna do? That's why he's always the number 1. Cause they got corner, he never gives up. That's why he's always Parappa, the number 1. Cause they got corner, he never gives Parappa. People give Parappa, we give Parappa, we give Parappa. In the front, people in the Parappa. Enjoying the Parappa, in the Parappa. That's why he's always the number 1. In the Parappa, we in the Parappa, in the Parappa, we in the Parappa, we in the Parappa. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 8. Parappa, back side, let's all get down. People in the front, Parappa. Cause they got corner, he never gives up. That's why he's always the number 1. Parappa, people in the back side to side, let's all get down. People in the front, Parappa. People in the back, Parappa. I got it, Parappa, Parappa. Got it, Parappa. Side, let's all Parappa, get down. People in the front, people, Parappa.
Wow, now this was surely a night to remember.
It sure was. I'll never forget tonight. Right, everybody?
I gotta believe. Say, oh yeah. you gonna do? I gotta believe. Say, oh yeah. What you gonna do? Say, alright. I gotta believe. And so
Checking slot 1. Are you sure you want to overwrite? Saving now. Save complete.
Okay, baby, let's go. We're gonna do it like this. 3, 2, 1. Ta Jamaican. 3, 2, 1.
English, ding, 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 Korean.
Thai or Jamaican.
English, Korean.
Thai or Jamaican.
English, ding, ding, Korean.
Thai or Jamaican. Thai or
What happened? Player 2, you can do better than that. 3, 2, 1. As long as they don't noodle, king of all food. 3, 2, 1.
As long as they got noodles, king of all food.
As long as they love food, anything's cool.
As long as they got noodles, king of all food.
As long as they love food, anything's cool.
As long as they got noodles, king of all food.
As long as they love food, anything's cool.
As long as they got king of all.
As long as they love food, anything's cool.
As long as they got noodles, king of all food.
As long as they love food, anything's cool.
As long as they got king of all.
As long as they love food, anything's cool.
As long as they got king of all.
What happened? Player 2, you can do better than that. 3, 2, 1. Great tasty pasta, blow to your chest. 3, 2, 1.
Great tastes blow to my chest.
Great tasty pasta, blow to your chest.
Great tastes blow, sweet, great taste, sweet,
Great tasty pasta, blow to your chest.
Great tastes blow, sweet, great taste, sweet.
Great tasty blow, pasta, great pasta,
Great tastes blow, sweet to my chest.
Great tasty blow, pasta,
Great tastes blow, blow.
Great tasty blow, pasta to your chest.
Great tastes blow, great blow.
Great tasty pasta, blow to your great tasty blow, pasta to your
Hey, that was a battle. Let's move on. 3, 2, 1. Thanks, brother, for letting me understand. The man must understand to keep his options open. 3, 2, 1.
Thanks, brother, let understand. Brother, let understand to keep our options open.
Welcome, brother, for letting you understand. The man must understand.
Thanks, brother, for letting me understand. Must open, understand, to keep his options. Thanks.
Welcome, brother, for letting you understand. The man must understand.
Thanks, brother, for letting me understand. Understand, man must open, understand, keep his options.
Well, brother, understand. Man, open. Welcome, an option.
Thanks, brother, for letting man open. Thanks,
brother. I understand that I keep.
Welcome, brother.
But brother, I understand. Brother, I understand that I keep.
Well, bro, let you understand. Oh, welcome, bro. Let you understand. But man,
thanks, brother, to let me understand. Understand, man, must dig open. Understand, keep as I keep as I.
well, bro, let you understand. But man, thanks,
brother, let me understand. Open, thanks, brother, let me understand, man. I'm open. Thanks, brother, I keep.
well, bro, let you understand. But man, thanks,
brother, let me understand. Open, thanks, brother, let me understand, man. I'm open. Thanks, brother, I keep.
well, bro, let you understand. But man,
thanks, brother, let me understand. Open, thanks, brother, let him the man open. I keep.
Alright! Player 1 wins! Player 2, you got blown away. Okay, baby, let's go. We're gonna do like this. 3, 2, 1. Press the burger, cook the fries. 3, 2, 1.
French the burgers, cook the fries. French burger, cook fries.
What happened? Player 2, you can do better than that. 3, 2, 1. The master is original. Master, I kick out, punch out, it's unforgettable. 3, 2, 1.
Master is original. Master, hey, tal kick is unforgettable.
the master is he's out, punch out.
Master is hey, master is kick out is on his.
The master is original. He's out,
Master is hey, master is kick out is on his.
the master is original. He's out.
Master is hey, master is kick out is on kick. Master is hey, master is kick out is on kick.
What happened? Player 1, you can do better than that. 3, 2, 1. Pump me back, son. Come, I gotta go. 3, 2, 1.
Put deep pump.
Put me back, son. Come, I gotta.
Put deep pump.
Put me, come back. I gotta go. Come.
Put deep pump.
Put me back. Come, I go. Come.
Put deep pump.
Back, son. Put me, come, I go. Come.
Put deep pump.
Put back, I can put go. Come, I go. Come.
Put me, come back.
Put me, come back. I gotta go. Come.
Put
going to be like this. 3, 2, 1. Say trim, die. Say trim, cut. 3, 2, 1.
Say die, 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 snip, cut.
Say trim, die, trim, cut.
Say die, 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 snip, cut.
Say trim, die, trim, cut.
Say trim, snip, cut, die, say trim.
Say trim, die, trim, cut.
Snip, trim, cut, die, trim, cut, die, snip.
Say trim, die, trim, cut.
Snip, trim, cut, die, trim, cut, die, snip.
Say trim, cut, die, cut, die, trim.
Snip, trim, cut, die, trim, cut, die,
Say trim, cut, die, cut.
snip, trim, cut, die, trim, cut, die,
Say trim, cut, die, cut, die.
snip, trim, cut, die, trim, cut, die,
Say trim, cut, die, cut, die.
snip, trim, cut, die, trim, cut, die,
Say trim, cut, die, cut, die.
snip, trim, cut, die, trim, cut, die.
What happened? Player 2, you can do better than that. 3, 2, 1. Trim the cut, change the clip. 3, 2, 1.
Trim the cut, change the tip.
Trim the cut, change the snip.
Trim the cut, change the tip.
Trim the cut, change the
Trim the cut, change the
trim,
tip.
change the
Trim the cut, change the
trim the cut, change the
trim cut, change the trim cut, change the
What happened? Player 2, you can do better than that. 3, 2, 1. Die, die, snap, snap, cut, cut. 3, 2, 1.
snip, die, snip, die, snip, die, cut, die, die, die,
tip, cut,
cut, die, cut, die, cut, die, snip, snip, die, die, die,
tip, cut,
die, die, cut, die, die,
tip, cut,
die, 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 snip, cut, die,
tip,
die, die, snip, cut, die,
What happened? Player 1, you can do better than that. 3, 2, 1. I'm not stop, just grooving. 3, 2, 1.
I'm not up, just grooving.
I'm not grooving, just grooving.
I'm not up, just grooving.
I'm not grooving, just grooving.
I'm not grooving, just grooving.
I'm grooving.
I'm not grooving, just grooving.
I'm not grooving, just stop not grooving.
I'm not grooving, just grooving.
I'm not grooving, just stop grooving.
I'm not grooving, just grooving.
I'm not grooving, just stop grooving.
I'm not grooving, just grooving.
I'm not grooving, just stop grooving.
I'm not grooving, just grooving.
I'm not grooving, just stop grooving.
I'm not grooving, just grooving.
I'm not grooving, just stop grooving.
I'm not grooving, just grooving.
I'm not grooving, just stop grooving.
All right. Player 1 wins. Player 2, you got blown away. Okay, baby, let's go. We're gonna do like this. 3, 2, 1. To the left, to the left. 3, 2, 1.
To the left,
What happened? Player 2, you can do better than that. 3, 2, 1. Lead it to the left, lead it to the right. 3, 2, 1.
Lean it left to lean it right. Lean it
left, right, left, right, left, right.
lean it to the left, lean it right. Lean it
Left, right, left, right, left, right, left.
lean left, right, left, right, left, right. Lean it
Right,
right,
right, left, right.
lean left, right, left, right, left, right, left. Lean it right,
Right, right, right, left, right, 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 right.
lean left, left, right, left, right, left.
Right, right, right,
let your beat body go.
Crave the feeding, crave the feeding,
Crave the speed, let your beat body go.
crave feed, body go.
Crave the speed, let your beat body go.
Crave feed,
Crave the speed, let your beat body go.
crave feeding body, crave body.
What happened? Player 1, you can do better than that. 3, 2, 1. Come on, please, please, come on. Old time, old time, say. 3, 2, 1.
Come on, come please, come on. Oh, say, oh, say, oh, say, oh, say.
Come on, come please, please. Come on, come on, come on, come on, come on, come on.
Please, come on. Oh, time, say, oh, time, say, oh.
Come on, come please, please, come please, please, come please, please.
Come on, come please, come on, come on, come on. Oh, come on, say, oh, come on. Come on, come please, come please, please, come please. Oh, say, oh, say, oh.
Hey, that was a battle. Let's move on. 3, 2, 1. Where's the rope? The rope. I gave it to you. I thought you had it. 3, 2, 1.
Where's the rope? The rope? Where's the rope? The rope? Where's I thought you had? I thought you.
Where's the boat? The boat. I gave to you. I thought you had the boat.
Where's the rope? The rope? Where's the rope? The rope I gave to you. I thought you had.
Where's the boat? Where's I gave to you. I thought you.
Where's the rope? The rope? Where's the rope? The rope I gave to you. I thought gave to you.
Where's the boat? I gave to you. I thought gave to you.
Where's the rope? The rope? Where's the rope? The rope I gave to you. I thought you had.
Where's the boat? Where's the boat? I gave to you. I thought you gave to.
Where's the rope? The rope? Where's the rope? The rope? Where's the where's the I gave to you.
Where's the boat? Where's the boat? I gave to you. I gave to.
Yeah! Player 1 wins. Player 2, you almost had it. Okay, baby, let's go. We're going to do it like this. 3, 2, 1. Huh? What's that sound? Huh? Who that be? Huh? What's that sound? What's that sound? Who that be? Huh? 3, 2, 1.
Huh?
What's who that be? What's that? What's that be? What's that be? What's who that be?
Huh?
What's who that? What's that? What's that? What's who that? What's that? What's that? What's who that? What's that? What's that? What's who that?
Huh?
Sound.
What's who that be? What's that? What's that be? What's that be? What's who that be?
Huh?
What's who that? What's that? What's that? What's who that? What's that? What's that? What's who that? What's that? What's that? What's who that? Sound.
Huh?
What's who that? What's that? What's that? What's who that? What's that? What's who that? What's that? Who that? What's that? What's that? Sound.
What's who that? What's that? What's that? What's who that? What's that? What's that? What's who that? What's that? What's that? What's who that? Sound. Huh?
What happened? Player 2, you can do better than that. 3, 2, 1. Pull the lever right now, or whatever, right now. 3, 2, 1.
Pull the lever, right? Oh, whatever, right?
Pull the right now, or whenever.
Pull the lever, right? Oh, whatever, right?
Pull the right now, or whenever.
Pull the right now, oh, whatever, right?
Pull the right now, or whenever.
Pull the right now, oh, now.
Pull the lever right now, or whenever.
Pull the right now, oh, right.
Pull the lever right now, or whenever.
Pull the right now, oh, well,
Pull the lever right now, or whenever.
pull the lever right now, oh, well,
Pull the lever right now, or whenever.
pull the lever right now, pull the, oh, well,
Pull the lever right now, or whenever.
pull the lever right now, pull the right, oh, whatever.
Pull the lever right, or right.
Pull the lever right now, oh, whatever.
Pull the right.
it all, fame.
You got all cash, all fame, all money, all fame.
I got all cash, fame, all money, all fame. I got all cash, all fame, all money, all fame. I got all cash, fame, all money, all fame.
Hey, that was a battle. Let's move on. 3, 2, 1. I'm gonna miss my favorite TV show. 3, 2, 1.
I'm gonna miss my favorite TV show.
Your baby boy, 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 boy.
I'm gonna miss my favorite TV show.
Your baby boy, 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 boy.
I'm gonna miss my favorite TV show.
Your baby boy, 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 boy.
I'm gonna miss my favorite TV show.
Your baby boy, 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 boy.
I'm gonna miss my favorite TV show.
Your baby boy, 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 boy. Your baby boy, 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 boy. Your baby boy, 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 boy. Your baby boy, 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 boy. Your baby boy, 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 boy. Your baby boy, 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 baby TV show.
Alright, player 1 wins. Player 2, you got blown away.
Ho, ho.
Okay, baby, let's go. We're gonna do it like this. 3, 2, 1. Punch, love, punch, turn, love, turn. 3, 2, 1.
Punch, love, punch, turn, turn, turn.
Love, punch, turn, turn.
Punch, love, turn, love, turn, love, love, turn.
Punch, love, punch, turn, punch, turn.
Punch, love, turn, love, 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 turn.
Punch, love, 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 love.
Punch, love, turn, love, turn, punch, love, turn.
Punch, love, 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 love.
Punch, love, turn, love, love, turn, punch, love, turn.
Punch, love, love, turn, punch, love.
Punch, love, turn, love, love, punch, love, love, turn.
Punch, love, 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 punch, love.
Punch, love, turn, punch, 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 punch.
Punch, love, 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 punch, love, love.
Punch, love, turn, punch, 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 punch.
Punch, love, punch, 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 punch.
What happened? Player 2, you can do better than that. 3, 2, 1. I hold you tight. Lovers, lovers, we are. 3, 2, 1.
I hold you tight. Bravos, bravos, we are.
I hold you, we are. We are, we are, we are, we are, we are.
I hold you tight. Bravos, bravos, we are. I hold tight. Bravos, bravos, we are. Tight, tight.
We are tight, we are tight, we are tight, we are tight, we are tight.
Bravos, we tight, we tight, we tight.
Tight, we are tight, we are tight, we are tight, we are tight.
We tight, we tight, we tight, we tight, we tight. Bravos, bravos.
We are tight, 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 we are tight.
What happened? Player 2, you can do better than that. 3, 2, 1. Need a good, oh yeah, need a good, oh yeah. 3, 2, 1.
Need a good lawyer, need a good lawyer.
Need a good lawyer, need a good lawyer, need a good lawyer, need a good lawyer, need a lawyer, good lawyer, good. Need a good lawyer, need a good lawyer, need a need lawyer, good, need lawyer, good. Need a good lawyer, need a good lawyer.
What happened? Player one, you can do better than that. 3, 2, 1. Come and make it, sensei. Here he comes to make way. 3, 2, 1.
타마네기 sensei. Yeah, he comes for make way.
Here he comes, sensei. Tamaneki,
타마네기 sensei. Yeah, he comes for make way.
Here he comes, sensei. Tamaneki, sensei.
타마네기 sensei. Yeah, he comes for make way.
Here he comes, sensei. Tamaneki, sensei.
Yeah, he comes sensei. 타마네기 sensei.
Here he comes, sensei. Tamaneki, sensei.
Yeah, he comes sensei. 타마네기 sensei.
Here he comes, sensei. Tamaneki, sensei.
Yeah, comes sensei. 타마네기 sensei.
All right, player one wins. Player two, you got blown away. Okay, baby, let's go. We're gonna do it like this. 3, 2, 1. Cut the lettuce. Cut the lettuce. Cut. 3, 2, 1.
Cut lettuce.
What happened? Player two, you can do better than that. 3, 2, 1. Toast the bun. Toast the bun. 3, 2, 1. What happened? Player two, you can do better than that. 3, 2, 1. Execute sooner. Better execute sooner. 3, 2, 1.
Execute sooner. Execute sooner. Execute sooner. Execute sooner.
Hey, that was a battle. Let's move on. 3, 2, 1. Toast the buns, French fries. 3, 2, 1.
Toast the buns, French fries.
Toast the French fries, French fries, fries.
toast fun, French fry.
Toast the French fun, French fry, fry.
Toast fun, French fry.
Toast the French fun, French fry, fry.
Toast fun, French fry.
Toast the French fun, French fry, fry.
Toast fun, French fry.
Toast the French fun, French fry.
Toast fun, French fry.
Toast the French fry, French fun, toast the French.
Toast fun, French fry.
Toast the French fry, fun, French.
Toast French fun, toast French.
Toast the French fry, fun, French fry.
Toast French fun, toast.
Toast the French fry, fun, French fry.
Toast French fun, French fry.
Toast the French fry, fun, French fry.
All right, player 1 wins. Player 2, you got blown away. Okay, baby, let's go. We're gonna do it like this. 3, 2, 1. You can do it, shake your body. 3, 2, 1.
You can do shake body.
Do it, shake your body.
You can do shake body.
You can body, do shake body.
Do shake body.
You can body, do shake body.
You can body. You can body. Do shake.
You can body, do shake body.
You can body. You can body. Do shake.
You can body, do shake body.
Welcome to the battle mode. The rules are simple. I'll give you a phrase to play, so player 1, try to play better than I did. Then player 2, you have to try and do better than what player 1 did. We'll do a few first round. Okay, baby, let's go. We're gonna do it like this. 3, 2, 1. It's party, party. Come on, come on. You can do it. Shake your body. 3, 2, 1.
Come shake body.
It's hard, you. Come on, come on. Hard, come on, shake my body.
It's hard, you. It's hard, come you on. Shake your body.
It's hard, you. Come on, do. Come on, do. Shake my body.
It's come shake your body. Come shake your body.
It's hard, you. Come on, do. Come on, do. Shake my body.
It's party, come shake your body. Come shake body.
It's hard, you. Come on, do. Come on, shake my body.
It's party, you can come shake body.
It's hard, you. Come on, do. Come on, shake my body.
It's party, you can come shake your body.
It's hard, you. Come on, do. Come on, do. Shake my body.
It's party, you can come shake your body.
What happened? Player 1, you can do better than that. 3, 2, 1. Come on. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Look around, everybody. 3, 2, 1.
Come on, to that 3, 4, 5, 3, 4, to everybody.
Come on, and look
to everybody.
Come on, look for, and everyone. 5, 2, alive, 4, 2.
Come 2, 3, 4, come on and look for in the line. 5, 4, 4, 2.
Come on, look for, and everyone. 5, 2, alive, 4, and
3, look for, come 3, look for, 2, 1, come on, 5, 2, 4, 2, alive.
Come 4, and 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 4, 4, 4, 4, 5, 4, 5.
3, look for, come 3, look for, 2, 1, come on, 5, 2, 4, 2, 4.
4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4
4, come 3, 4, 2, 1, come on, 5, 2, 4, 4, 2.
What happened? Player 2, you can do better than that. 3, 2, 1. He never gives up. He never gives up. 3, 2, 1.
He never gives up. He never gives up. He never gives up.
He never gives up. He never gives up. Never.
He never gives up. He never gives up. He never.
He never gives up. He never gives up. Never.
He never gives. He gives. He gives.
He never gives up. He never gives up.
He never gives. He gives. He gives. Never.
He never gives. He gives. He gives.
He never gives up. He gives up. Gives up.
He never gives. He gives. He gives up.
He never gives. He gives. He gives up.
He never gives up. He never gives.
What happened? Player 2, you can do better than that. 3, 2, 1. Time to talk. Let's all get down. 3, 2, 1.
Yourself.
Get up, 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 get this, believe yourself.
Give it up yourself. Believe in yourself. Believe in yourself.
Get up, get up, get up, get up, believe it. Get up yourself. Get up yourself. Believe it.
Give it yourself.
Get up, get up yourself. Get up yourself. Get up yourself. Get up, believe yourself. Yourself.
Give up yourself. Give up yourself. Believe in.
Get up, get up. Get up. Get up.
Give up. Believe. Give up yourself. Give up yourself. Believe in.
Yeah! Player 1 wins! Player 2, you almost had it!
May I help? You want to load or save? Are you sure you want to over saving now? Save complete.